I've just organised my portfolio for the first time in months, and I promise that I tell you guys how to make feedback summaries for your portfolio. Getting feedback for your work is actually so important because it not only shows that you've done something, it shows how you've progressed and built on your skills throughout your career, particularly for things like teaching, public speaking, presentations, all of those sorts of things. So try to get feedback wherever you can, especially if you are doing any form of teaching and you want to have a teaching career in the future. But how do you collect feedback? How do you present it? What do you do with it all? I'm here to show you. So when I did my medical education special study module, I created my own feedback form to give to students who I'd taught and staff members who had observed me teaching or who I'd worked with during the 4-week attachment. I create all of my feedback forms on Google Forms. I just find it a bit easier than Microsoft Forms. And there's a few key things that I always like to include in my feedback forms to make my feedback summaries as useful as possible and as informative as possible. So my first tip is to make feedback forms anonymous. Usually people are going to be a bit more honest with you and more likely to give you feedback if they know that their feedback is going to remain anonymous. If you're delivering multiple different teaching sessions or conference presentations in a period of time, rather than creating multiple different feedback forms, you can just select the option for someone to select which session they've attended. So that's what I did with my teaching sessions. It just means that all the information is in one place and it makes one nice summary document. And then the questions you choose are really up to you to decide what you want to get out of the feedback and how you're going to improve going forward. Things that I like to include typically are how confident I was as a presenter, how well the information was presented or conveyed, if you would recommend me as a teacher or a presenter again, and then areas where I could improve and areas that I did really well. And I also like to include a mix of ratings questions and free text questions, because we all know when someone fills out a feedback form, half of the time they might just put one word in the box, which isn't very useful. So having those rating questions still gives you some type of response, even if people aren't being as talkative in the free text questions. So I like to do a bit like a like-it scale. So from a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very good and 1 being really poor, how well did your teacher convey this topic? And students can kind of pick that sort of thing. So I'll put in a few examples of what I'm talking about in the video. And then sometimes you do have to be a bit annoying about it to get people to fill out your feedback, but it is really important for your portfolio and building your presence. And it's also just helpful to know things that you've done well and also where you can improve going forward, because you might have never thought about something. So for example, if you went over a topic a little bit too quickly, or if your slides had too much information on them. I would recommend creating a QR code to stick on the end of your slides for people to scan, or to print one off and keep it in your pocket, because that's what I did when I was doing my teaching, because I'd be teaching on the wards and I wouldn't have an opportunity to go and get my computer to show people the QR code that way. So I just printed out a little one that I kept in my pocket. It's much better if you can get people to fill out their feedback there and then, rather than emailing the link out to people at a later date, because half of the time people just won't fill it out. If you're doing teaching sessions, I always ask that people fill out the feedback form in order to receive a copy of the slides or the answers that we've gone through in that session. And usually that's a little bit of an incentive for people to actually fill out the feedback form. The same goes for any events that you hold. So if people want a certificate for the event, they need to fill out a feedback form to do that. That works really well at things like conferences. So if someone wants a certificate of their attendance to a conference, they need to fill out the feedback form to do that. And for things like that, it's good if you give people a time frame to fill things out, so you know that it's going to be done by a certain date. Because the worst thing is having someone months down the line asking for a certificate way after the deadline closed for you to fill out the feedback form. For bigger events where you do want to generate a feedback form and certificates quite quickly, there are apps and websites and things you can use to do that, rather than making them individually. When I'm making certificates for feedback forms, I just do it on Canva. So now, hopefully you've got all of your feedback. Depending on how many responses you've garnered will depend on how long your summary is, depend on how many questions that you use in your feedback form. That will all factor into how long your feedback summary is and how much work it will be. So first things first is making your feedback summary look nice. So I do this on Word. I don't do it on Google Docs. I do it on Word just because I prefer doing things like that on Word, even though I make all my feedback forms on Google Forms. So on Word, I'll create a title for the feedback summary. So I think the example that I'm going to show here is the GP Self Conference feedback summary. And as you can see, I've included the logos of GPSOC, University of Nottingham, and RCGP, because these were all of the bodies who were involved in that event. If it's a personal feedback form for things that you've done at the university, you can still put the university's logo on it, and I just put the medical school's address on it too, just as kind of a letterhead, and it makes it look a little bit more professional. So I put all of that in the header section of the feedback summary, and then I title what the feedback summary is for. After that, I give kind of a brief overview of what the actual event was, because when you're looking back through this in your portfolio, you'll probably forget what you even did for the event. You might forget really key parts of it. So I put what the event was, when it was held, how many attendees, all of those sorts of things will go in that immediate description. And also put that you're the one who's created the feedback summary. So sometimes I make these summaries and distribute them to my committee. So I like to put that I made the summary just in case anyone sees it. And then I write how many responses that the feedback form got. This is really important because when you're showing percentages and things later on, it makes a big difference if this is from 100 people versus about 5 people. Now, these feedback forms are not super duper professional or statistical, nothing like that. It's kind of just showing a brief overview of all the data for yourself that's easily understandable. And if you're in a job interview or something, you can easily show and go through this data. If you do want to do crazy statistical analysis on it, you're more than welcome to, but I'd save that for research publications. So for any quantitative data, so data purely involving numbers, I will go into Excel. Once again, I don't do this on Google Sheets, so I download the feedback form summary on Excel and I go through that, and you can just select the whole column and that will give you an average of all the responses from that column. So if something's from 1 to 5, your average could be something like 4.5. And that's just a much better way of showing the information rather than putting 10 people voted 3, 10 people voted 4, that sort of thing, because that's quite wordy. But if you just put the average there, you can always put below it, and sometimes I do the breakdown of those responses, but the average just gives you the overall what people were thinking. So for something like a 1 to 5 scale, anything above 3 would be considered quite good, and anything below 3 not very good, and around 3 is average, if that all makes sense. So that's how I'll summarize all of my quantitative data. I do it all the same way. Then if I have questions that are like yes, no, or maybe, I can display those in a pie chart, or sometimes I just do the percentages of total responses for each of those questions. So 20% of those responded voted no. This is usually for if I'm asking if people would recommend me as a teacher or recommend a society's event to a friend, or if they'd come to an event again. And then likewise, if over 50% of people are saying yes, then that's pretty good. Other things that you might display in bar or pie charts include if you're asking for any demographic data from people, you can display that in a pie chart. So how many of your attendees identified as female, how many identified as male, that sort of thing. Sometimes having a few pie charts and a few graphs do make things look a bit nicer in the feedback summary, but it's definitely not necessary. It's just you deciding what is the best way to display that data. Then for qualitative data, so anything that's quite wordy, the free text questions, that's when it can become a little bit difficult to display this data, because you want to make sure you're giving a true representation of what people said, whilst also if you have a really big data set, you don't want to be including every single feedback point from people. So for this, I'll usually go through the responses, I'll copy and paste them into a Word document so it's a little bit easier to see than in the spreadsheet, and I'll make notes of key things that keep being repeated. So for example, if someone said that the resources were really good or that the speaker was really confident, those are things that I'll put, and then I'll do a little summary where I'll say, common themes that came up amongst those who filled out the feedback form include X, Y, and Z. And then from that, I always like to include a few direct quotes from the feedback too, and I'll represent that in quotation marks in italics. This is just really nice because it makes your feedback summary feel a bit more personal and what people have actually kind of got from your event or your session. And then at the end, I put points for improvement based on that session. So what were my main takeaways that I think we could improve for next time? Is it that we need to give the session a little bit more time? Do we need to improve the PowerPoints that we use? What sorts of things are people saying didn't work as well as they could do? And then similarly, I like to say the things that worked really well. So that's just a little kind of bullet point summary at the end that I can share with my committee members, or just have a look at myself and think, yeah, this is what I did really well, and then this is where I can improve for next time. I didn't used to do all of my feedback summaries this way. So if you had a look through my portfolio from some of the first feedback summaries I did a few months ago, I have changed the way that I do them. I think they look a bit nicer now. I think they read better and they look more professional than they did when I first started. So it is definitely just a learning curve, but it's just a great thing to have in your portfolio. It shows that you've meaningfully gone through the feedback, had a look at it, and have thought about how you can improve things going forward. Main takeaways from this video: any session you do, please get feedback. It's so important for your portfolio and when you're applying for jobs in the future, because it's proof that you did something and proof that you've improved since then. It shows your journey throughout your career. For any conference presentation that you do, why not stick up a QR code at the end, just asking for some feedback? You might have no one fill it out, but even if you get a couple of responses, that is better than nothing. I hope this video has been useful for you. It's another installment into my portfolio series, because I know a lot of people have had questions about this and some people don't know where to start at all, which is completely fair because sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on Instagram at Aisia Lea Medic or leave a comment down below. And if you like these types of videos, this type of content, why not subscribe to my channel? Thank you.